The strangest thing about being erased is that no one ever announces it. One day you reach for your favorite chair, and someone else is already sitting there. You tell yourself it doesn't matter. Then you notice your family smiling as if that's how it has always been. I should have spoken up the moment she looked at me across the dinner table and said, with the sweetest smile anyone had ever worn, "Would you mind sitting over there?" It just makes more sense now. No one laughed. No one objected. My own son simply nodded and moved my plate without asking. I wish I could tell you that was the worst part, but it wasn't. The worst part was what happened after everyone acted as though I had imagined the whole thing. That was the night I realized someone wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to replace me. And by the time I understood how far she had already gone, almost every trace of the life I had built had quietly disappeared. My name still appeared on the family photographs hanging in the hallway, but somehow I no longer belonged inside them. Looking back now, I can see that the dinner wasn't the beginning. It was only the first moment I was finally able to see what had been happening for months. My name is Margaret Sullivan. I'm 70 years old, and until 2 years ago I believed I had the kind of family every mother prayed for. My husband, Robert, and I spent more than 4 decades building a home in a quiet Ohio neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names and children still rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on. We raised our only son, Ethan, in that house. Every scratch on the hardwood floor had a story behind it. Every tree in the backyard had been planted with our own hands. After Robert passed away following a brief illness, I stayed because the house still felt alive with memories. Ethan visited every Sunday without fail during that first year. He checked on me, fixed little things around the house, and made sure I wasn't spending too much time alone. Then Lauren came into his life. At first, I was relieved to see him smiling again. She was charming, polished, and seemed genuinely interested in bringing the family closer together. She remembered birthdays, brought homemade desserts to dinner, and insisted on hugging me every time she arrived. Friends told me how lucky I was to have such a thoughtful daughter-in-law. I believed them because I wanted to believe them. Small changes began so quietly that questioning them would have made me seem unreasonable. Lauren suggested moving Sunday dinners an hour earlier because it worked better for everyone. Then she volunteered to organize Thanksgiving because she claimed I deserved to rest. Christmas decorations I had used for decades stayed in their boxes, while new ones appeared throughout the house. Family recipes became Lauren's recipes. Traditions slowly became her traditions. Every adjustment seemed harmless by itself, and every time I hesitated, Ethan smiled and said, "Mom, she's only trying to help." I kept telling myself that families evolve, that younger generations naturally create their own routines. I ignored the uncomfortable feeling growing inside me because love often asks us to be patient. What I didn't know was that patience can sometimes become permission. And while I was trying not to make anyone uncomfortable, someone else was quietly rewriting my place in my own family. I told myself that maybe I was simply noticing things because grief had changed the way I looked at the world. After losing Robert, every empty room felt louder, every silence lasted longer, and every small change seemed larger than it probably was. That was the explanation I offered myself each time another familiar piece of my life quietly slipped away. Then one Tuesday afternoon I stopped by Ethan and Lauren's house without calling first. I had baked Ethan's favorite apple pie, the same recipe my grandmother had handed down to me more than 50 years earlier. I still remembered him as a little boy standing on a kitchen chair beside me, stealing slices of fresh apples before they ever reached the pie crust. I smiled all the way to their front porch, believing some memories never changed. Lauren answered the door with her usual bright smile, but it faded for just a second when she realized I had arrived unexpectedly. It was only a heartbeat so quick that another person might not have noticed it. I did. She stepped aside and invited me in. But something immediately felt different. The living room had been completely rearranged. Family photographs that once filled the shelves had disappeared, replaced by carefully framed pictures of Ethan, Lauren, and the children taken during vacations I had never even heard about. I searched the shelves without meaning to. There was one small photograph of Robert and me tucked into a corner behind a decorative candle. It looked less like a family memory and more like an afterthought. Lauren noticed where my eyes had settled. She smiled gently and said, "I thought the house needed a fresher look. The children like seeing newer memories." I nodded because I could not think of anything polite to say. A few minutes later, my granddaughter Emma ran downstairs carrying a drawing she had made at school. She ran straight past me and into Lauren's arms. "Look what I made, Mom," she said with excitement. I smiled at the innocent mistake until I realized she had not made one at all. Lauren had become the center of every conversation, every celebration, every decision, exactly as she should have as a mother. That was not what unsettled me. What unsettled me was that I suddenly felt like a distant relative visiting instead of the grandmother who had once spent 3 afternoons every week helping with homework, baking cookies, and reading bedtime stories whenever Ethan worked late. During dinner, Lauren announced that she had already planned Thanksgiving. She listed the menu, assigned everyone their responsibilities, and even decided where each person would sit. Ethan complimented her organization. The children clapped with excitement. No one asked whether I wanted to make the pumpkin pie that had been on our Thanksgiving table every single year since Ethan was 5 years old. It was such a small tradition, barely worth mentioning, yet I felt its absence more than I could explain. As I drove home that evening through streets glowing with early autumn leaves, I replayed every conversation in my mind. Nothing Lauren had said sounded cruel. Nothing Ethan had done appeared disrespectful. Each moment by itself seemed harmless. But together they formed something I could no longer ignore. I was not being pushed out all at once. I was being replaced one quiet decision at a time, so gently that anyone watching from the outside would have believed it was simply the natural way families changed. I spent the next several weeks telling myself that I was imagining things, but the uncomfortable feeling refused to disappear. Instead, it grew stronger every time I visited. The changes became almost impossible to ignore once I stopped making excuses for them. Lauren had an extraordinary talent for making every decision sound thoughtful and practical. If she moved furniture, it was because the room needed better flow. If she changed family traditions, it was because children enjoyed new experiences. If she answered questions directed at Ethan before he had the chance to speak, everyone simply admired how well they understood each other. No single moment seemed serious enough to challenge. Together, they quietly reshaped the entire family. One Saturday morning, Ethan called and invited me to watch my grandson Noah's soccer game. I packed orange slices, bottled water, and the old folding chair Robert and I had used for years at every school event. When I arrived at the field, I noticed Lauren had already gathered several parents around her. She greeted everyone by name, laughing easily while organizing snacks and talking about the upcoming school fundraiser. I smiled because she genuinely seemed kind, and I wanted to be happy that my grandchildren had such an involved mother. As I walked toward them, another parent stopped me with a warm smile. "You must be Lauren's mother," she said. For a second I simply stared at her. Before I could answer, Lauren laughed softly and replied, "Oh no, this is Ethan's mom." The woman apologized immediately, clearly embarrassed, but the conversation lingered in my thoughts long after the game ended. It was not the mistake that stayed with me. It was the strange expression that crossed Lauren's face before she corrected her. It almost looked like satisfaction, as though the misunderstanding had quietly confirmed something she wanted the world to believe. A few days later, I stopped by the grocery store after attending my weekly church group. While choosing fresh vegetables, I ran into my longtime neighbor, Grace Miller. We had lived on the same street for nearly 30 years and knew each other's families almost as well as our own. She hugged me warmly before lowering her voice. "Margaret, I hope you do not mind me asking something." I smiled and told her she could ask me anything. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I ran into Lauren downtown yesterday. She was meeting with an interior designer." She introduced herself as the woman who was finally putting the Sullivan house in order. Grace watched my face carefully. "I assumed you and Ethan had moved in together." I forced a polite smile and quietly explained that I still lived alone in my own house. Grace frowned. "That is odd." The way she spoke made it sound like she had always been the one running everything. We finished shopping together, but her words stayed with me during the drive home. They echoed through my empty kitchen while I unpacked groceries and arranged flowers on the table Robert had built with his own hands decades earlier. For the first time, I stopped asking whether I was being overly sensitive. Instead, I began asking a different question. Why did so many people who barely knew our family already believe that Lauren had always been at its center? The answer frightened me because it suggested this was never about replacing traditions alone. It was about replacing the person everyone associated with those traditions, and somehow almost no one had noticed it happening except me. I could have confronted Lauren that very afternoon. I could have called Ethan and repeated every word Grace had told me. For several hours I even rehearsed the conversation in my head. I imagined Ethan looking surprised, apologizing, promising that everything had simply been a misunderstanding. But every version of that conversation ended the same way. I would sound insecure, Lauren would calmly explain everything away, and I would become the grieving widow who could not accept that families changed. That night I opened the old cedar chest Robert had built during our first year of marriage. It sat at the foot of my bed, holding the pieces of our life that neither of us had ever wanted to throw away. There were faded Christmas cards, yellowed newspaper clippings, vacation photographs, and anniversary letters tied together with a pale blue ribbon. I had not opened it since the week after his funeral because the memory still carried more weight than I could bear. As I carefully sorted through the contents, one envelope slipped onto the hardwood floor. My name was written across the front in Robert's unmistakable handwriting. I smiled through tears before realizing I had never seen that envelope before. It must have been tucked between the pages of an old photo album all those years. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. Robert had written it several years before he became ill, during one of those quiet weekends when he seemed unusually reflective. Most of the letter was exactly what I expected from the man I had loved for 45 years. He thanked me for standing beside him through difficult seasons, for believing in him when he doubted himself, and for making our house feel like home no matter what life brought us. Then I reached a paragraph that made me stop reading altogether. Robert wrote that families naturally changed over time, but he hoped I would never confuse kindness with surrender. He reminded me that I had spent decades holding our family together, and warned me that there might come a day when someone would mistake my gentle nature for weakness. He did not mention any names because there were none to mention then, yet every sentence seemed written for the very season of life I was now living. The final line lingered in my thoughts long after I folded the letter closed. It said, "Do not fight for attention, Margaret. Simply stand in the truth. Time has a remarkable way of revealing who belongs where." I placed the letter on my nightstand and sat quietly until dawn. For the first time in months, I stopped focusing on Lauren's behavior and began examining my own. I realized I had spent all my energy trying to avoid making anyone uncomfortable. I accepted every change because I believed keeping peace was the same as protecting my family. Robert's words helped me understand that real peace could never be built on pretending not to notice what was happening. The next morning I called Grace and invited her over for coffee. She listened patiently as I shared the letter with her. When I finished reading it aloud, she smiled gently and reached across the table. "Margaret," she said softly, "you have spent your whole life making room for everyone else. Maybe it is time to stop stepping aside every time someone walks toward you." Her words settled into my heart beside Robert's letter. I still had no intention of arguing with Lauren or accusing anyone of anything. But for the first time, I understood that quietly observing was not the same as quietly surrendering. And from that day forward I decided I would pay attention to every detail, no matter how small it seemed. I began saying yes to everything. When Lauren offered to host Sunday dinner, I smiled and thanked her for taking the pressure off my shoulders. When she volunteered to organize Christmas shopping months earlier than usual, I complimented her planning. When she suggested creating a shared family calendar so everyone could keep track of birthdays, school events, and vacations, I told her it sounded like a wonderful idea. The more agreeable I became, the more comfortable she seemed. It was almost as if she had been waiting for me to stop holding on to the traditions that had quietly defined our family for decades. Ethan noticed the change as well. One evening he called just to check on me. "Mom, you have been so relaxed lately," he said with a cheerful laugh. "I was worried all these changes might be difficult for you." I answered honestly, "At least partly. Life teaches you that fighting every little change only makes your heart tired." He sounded relieved. I could almost hear the weight lifting from his shoulders. "Lauren says the same thing," he replied. "She keeps telling me you deserve to enjoy retirement instead of feeling responsible for everyone." His words stayed with me after we ended the call. Responsibility had never felt like a burden to me. It had always felt like love. There is a quiet difference between serving your family because you choose to and being told your role is no longer necessary. Lauren never understood that difference because she only saw the tasks. She never saw the memories attached to them. One Friday afternoon she invited me over while the children were still at school. "I need your opinion," she said warmly. When I arrived, she walked me through nearly every room in the house, pointing out furniture she wanted to replace, paint colors she had chosen, and plans for remodeling the kitchen. She spoke with confidence, using phrases like our long-term vision and the future of this home. I listened carefully, nodding from time to time, but one sentence caught my attention immediately. "I want the house to finally reflect who we are now," she said with a satisfied smile. Finally. Such a simple word. Yet it quietly suggested that everything before her had somehow been incomplete. Before I left, she opened a hallway closet to show me shelves she had reorganized. Sitting on the highest shelf was a cardboard box filled with framed photographs. I recognized them instantly. They were the pictures that had once filled the living room. Robert teaching Ethan to ride his first bicycle. Our family camping trip in the Smoky Mountains. The portrait taken on our 40th wedding anniversary. "I packed these away because the rooms were starting to feel cluttered," Lauren explained casually. "The children connect more with recent memories anyway." I smiled politely and thanked her for showing me around, but something inside me settled with complete clarity. She was not simply decorating a house. She was editing a family history. That evening I returned home and began writing in a notebook I had kept untouched for years. I recorded dates, conversations, small observations, and even words that seemed unimportant at first. Not because I wanted to build a case against anyone, but because memory can become unreliable when emotions are involved. Facts cannot. As the pages slowly filled, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Every decision, every rearranged photograph, every new tradition pointed in the same direction. Lauren was not asking the family to make room for her. She was quietly encouraging everyone to forget who had been there long before she arrived, and for the first time I felt certain that sooner or later, the truth would reveal itself without me needing to force it. I continued filling the notebook every evening until it became part of my routine. I never wrote with anger. I simply recorded what I saw, what I heard, and what quietly changed from one week to the next. The notebook was not about proving anyone wrong. It reminded me to trust my own memory. Before long, I no longer needed to search for patterns because they appeared on nearly every page. One Saturday morning Ethan called and asked whether I could stop by while he took Noah to a science fair. Lauren would be meeting with contractors about the kitchen renovation, and someone needed to stay with Emma until her dance class began. I happily agreed. Spending time with my grandchildren had always been the brightest part of my week. When I arrived, Lauren greeted me warmly before gathering a stack of folders from the dining room table. She looked organized as always, dressed neatly with a tablet tucked under one arm and a notebook under the other. "Everything is finally coming together," she said with a satisfied smile. "This house is becoming exactly what our family needs." I smiled politely and wished her luck with the meeting. After everyone left, the house grew wonderfully quiet. Emma sat in the living room coloring while soft music played through the speakers. I made us both a cup of hot chocolate, then wandered into the kitchen to rinse our mugs. That was when I noticed one of Lauren's folders still resting on the counter. I had no intention of opening it. In fact, I reached to place it safely on a nearby shelf. As I lifted it, several papers slipped onto the floor. I bent down to gather them before Emma wandered into the room. Most were ordinary design sketches and cabinet measurements, but one page immediately caught my attention. It listed rooms by name, followed by descriptions of furniture and keepsakes. Beside several entries were handwritten notes that read, "Remove," "Donate," and "Storage." One line stopped me completely. It simply read, "Old family photographs. Replace with updated gallery wall." I stared at those words for several seconds before carefully returning every page exactly as I had found it. Perhaps there was an innocent explanation. Perhaps there was not. Either way, I refused to jump to conclusions. Instead, I quietly wrote the date in my notebook later that evening along with the exact wording I had seen. 2 days later, Grace invited me to lunch at a small cafe overlooking the town square. As we talked, she asked whether anything new had happened. I hesitated before telling her about the document. Grace listened without interrupting. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and folded her hands. "Margaret," she said gently, "there is something I have wanted to tell you for weeks, but I was afraid it would only hurt you." My stomach tightened. She explained that several neighbors believed Lauren had been introducing herself at community events as the woman who had transformed the Sullivan family after difficult years. Grace emphasized that no one had questioned the story because it sounded so natural coming from someone who spoke with such confidence. I thanked her for being honest. As I drove home beneath a sky filled with golden autumn light, Robert's letter returned to my thoughts. He had written that time would reveal who belonged where. For the first time, I sensed that moment was drawing closer. The changes were no longer happening only inside our family. A new version of our family's story was quietly spreading beyond our front door, and I realized that before long, everyone would have to decide which version they believed. The invitation arrived 3 weeks later. Lauren had organized what she called a family planning dinner, explaining that everyone should gather before the holidays became too busy. She sounded excited on the phone, describing it as an evening to celebrate new beginnings and discuss plans for the coming year. Her voice was warm, almost affectionate, and if I had not spent the past several months quietly observing, I might have believed every word. I arrived carrying a homemade pecan pie, the same dessert Robert always requested on special occasions. Ethan greeted me with a quick hug before returning to help Noah finish setting the table. Emma proudly showed me the centerpiece she had made with colorful leaves collected from the backyard. For a brief moment, everything felt wonderfully familiar. Then I noticed that my place setting had been moved to the far end of the table. For more than 40 years, whether in my own home or someone else's, I had always sat beside Robert or Ethan. It had never been discussed. It was simply where family naturally gathered around one another. This time Lauren smiled brightly and explained, "I thought this arrangement would make conversations flow better." No one questioned it. I quietly took my seat. During dinner, Lauren spoke confidently about renovations, school activities, vacation ideas, and long-term financial planning. She referred to nearly every decision using the words "our family" and "our future." Each time Ethan nodded in agreement, I noticed the children looking toward her before speaking, almost as though they were waiting for permission without realizing it. After dessert, Lauren gently tapped her glass with a spoon. The room became quiet. She smiled around the table with the calm confidence of someone completely certain she belonged at the center of every conversation. "I have been thinking about how much our family has grown," she began. "It feels like the perfect time to simplify traditions and create a stronger identity for future generations." Everyone listened attentively. She continued by suggesting a complete redesign of the annual holiday gathering. She wanted to replace the old recipe book with a new digital collection, retire several longtime traditions, update family photographs, and even create a new display in the hallway highlighting what she called the next chapter of the Sullivan family. Her words were gentle, carefully chosen, and impossible to criticize without appearing unreasonable. Then she looked directly at me. "Margaret, I hope you understand that families have to evolve. Holding on to the past sometimes prevents everyone else from moving forward." The room became perfectly still. Ethan lowered his eyes toward his coffee cup. The children quietly returned to coloring on their placemats, unaware that anything unusual had been said. I looked around the table and realized something important. No one there believed they were witnessing disrespect. They believed they were watching progress. I folded my napkin neatly onto my lap and smiled. "You may be right," I answered softly. "Every family eventually writes a new chapter." Relief immediately spread across Lauren's face. Ethan smiled for the first time that evening. The conversation quickly moved on to vacation plans and school schedules. No one noticed that I had said only half of what I truly meant. As I prepared to leave, Lauren walked me to the front door. She hugged me warmly and whispered, "Thank you for understanding. I knew this would be easier once everyone accepted the changes." I returned her smile, wished everyone a good night, and drove home beneath a sky filled with bright winter stars. When I reached my house, I placed Robert's letter beside my notebook, opened to a fresh page, and wrote only one sentence. Tonight they stopped hiding what they believed. Now all that remained was for the truth to introduce itself. The following week brought the first snowfall of the season. I woke before sunrise, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat beside the living room window watching the neighborhood slowly disappear beneath a blanket of white. There was something comforting about fresh snow. It covered everything equally without changing what lay underneath. I found myself thinking that truth often worked the same way. It might remain hidden for a while, but eventually the warmth of time uncovered every detail. Later that afternoon, Ethan called unexpectedly. His voice sounded unusually tired. He asked if I would come by because he wanted help sorting through several boxes that had been moved into the garage during the renovations. Lauren had taken the children shopping, leaving the house unusually quiet. When I arrived, Ethan looked distracted. He apologized for the mess and explained that contractors had boxed up everything from the hallway and family room. We spent nearly an hour carrying dusty containers across the garage floor. Most held ordinary things such as holiday decorations, old books, and framed artwork. Then I noticed a familiar wooden box tucked beneath a workbench. It was the memory box Robert and I had assembled over decades. Inside were handwritten recipes, birthday cards from Ethan's childhood, photographs, newspaper clippings, and letters exchanged throughout our marriage. I smiled with relief. I had wondered where it had gone. Ethan looked surprised when I recognized it. Lauren said these were mostly outdated keepsakes, he said casually. She thought we should store them until we decided what to do. I carefully lifted the lid and found everything arranged exactly as Robert and I had left it years earlier. On top rested the family recipe book, its worn leather cover softened by countless holiday dinners. Emma wandered into the garage just then after returning home early with Lauren. She immediately pointed toward the book. "Grandma, that is the pie book," she said excitedly. "Mom said we might not need it anymore because everything is online now." Her words were innocent. She smiled proudly, unaware of the weight they carried. I knelt beside her and opened the first page. There, in faded blue ink, was a note Robert had written decades earlier after accidentally spilling flour across the kitchen counter. Emma laughed at the story as I read it aloud. Ethan leaned closer. Then another page revealed measurements written in his own uneven handwriting from when he was 8 years old and insisted on helping bake cookies. He stared quietly at the page for several seconds before smiling in a way I had not seen for a very long time. "I forgot I wrote that," he whispered. We continued turning pages together. Every recipe carried another memory. Every photograph inside the box connected to another family tradition. Lauren stepped into the garage carrying shopping bags just as Emma excitedly showed her one of the old photographs. For the first time since I had known her, Lauren seemed unsure of herself. She looked from the memory box to Ethan, then back to me. No one spoke for several moments. There was no accusation, no argument, and no dramatic confrontation. There was only the quiet realization that some things could not simply be packed into storage without taking part of a family's identity with them. Ethan gently closed the recipe book and looked at me with thoughtful eyes. "Mom," he said softly, "maybe we moved some things aside too quickly." It was a simple sentence, but after months of silence, it felt like the first crack in a story that had seemed impossible to change. The days that followed were quieter than any I could remember. Not because everything had suddenly become perfect, but because something invisible had shifted inside our family. Ethan called more often, sometimes with no particular reason except to ask how I was doing, or to tell me about something funny Emma had said after school. He even asked if I still had Robert's old chili recipe, because Noah wanted to make it for the school cooking project. I smiled when I heard those words. It was not the recipe that mattered. It was the fact that he remembered where it came from. A few weeks before Christmas, Ethan invited me over early to help decorate the tree before everyone else arrived. As we carefully unpacked ornaments from worn cardboard boxes, he paused while holding a small wooden snowflake Robert had carved by hand many years earlier. "I almost forgot about this," he admitted quietly. "I think I forgot about a lot of things." There was regret in his voice, but there was also honesty. I placed the ornament on a nearby branch and gently touched his arm. "We all forget sometimes," I said. "What matters is what we choose to remember after we notice." Lauren entered the room carrying mugs of hot chocolate for everyone. She looked at the tree, then at the memory boxes spread across the living room floor. For several long moments she said nothing. Finally she walked toward me holding one of the framed photographs that had disappeared months earlier. It showed Robert standing beside Ethan on the day they built the backyard treehouse together. Without making a speech or offering excuses, she handed the frame to me. "I think this belongs back in the hallway," she said quietly. It was not a dramatic apology, nor did I expect one. Sometimes people reveal more through a small action than through 1,000 carefully chosen words. During Christmas dinner, the table looked different. Not because of expensive decorations or elaborate centerpieces, but because old traditions quietly returned alongside new ones. Emma insisted that we bake the pie using the handwritten recipe. Noah wanted to hear the story behind every ornament before hanging it on the tree. Ethan asked me to sit beside him, just as I had for countless holidays before. No one announced the change. No one needed to. As I looked around the table, I realized something I wished I had understood much earlier. A family's heart does not belong to the loudest voice, the newest idea, or the person standing at the center of every photograph. It belongs to the people who keep showing up with patience, kindness, and love, year after year, even when no one notices. That night, after everyone had gone home, I placed Robert's letter back inside the cedar chest. Beside it, I laid the notebook I had filled over those long months. I did not need to add another page because the story had already reached its ending. I had never won by arguing. I had never needed to expose anyone or demand recognition. Time had done exactly what Robert promised it would do. It quietly revealed the difference between changing a house and building a home. One can be accomplished with fresh paint, new furniture, and careful plans. The other can only be earned through years of unwavering love. That is something no one can inherit, borrow, or quietly take away. Because a place in a family's heart is never secured by replacing another person. It is earned by honoring the people who came before you, and that truth will always outlast every passing season.